Hello and welcome to this episode of Trash to Track. In this episode we're going to be looking at restoring this Hornby Class 60 that we picked up in one of the Gems or Junk videos a few months back from the Spalding Toy Fair. The body shell doesn't look too bad, although it's missing all its horns, but the chassis and the buffer beam leave a lot to be desired. Most of the detail is missing on the bogies and the underframe. The wheels and all the axles are absolutely filthy and covered in fluff. These two compressors are missing, which you cannot get as a spare part. And this bogie frame on this end of the model seems to be broken. The livery on this model also is too modern for me, so I'm going to either look at replacing the body shell or repainting this into train load construction livery. So let's give it a battery test. Now, if memory serves, when we tested this when we bought it, it was actually quite a nice and smooth runner and the lights worked on either end. So mechanically there might not be a lot to do on this model. And yet it's still running quite nicely, and you can see there just that the lights are working. Now, when I was doing this Trash to Track, I was tipped off that Hornby Railways had some spare body shells in the factory at Margate, and if I was to contact them, I may get a replacement for this, either very cheap or free of charge. So we'll have a look at that in a minute, but I'm just going to pop the body shell off here, and it's only held on with 4 clips to reveal the chassis and the cabs there, and it also shows that the previous owner has soldered all the wires to this. Now, going back to the body shell, I was told that livery was too nice to repaint, so Hornby actually sent me one in the correct livery that I was going to paint this in anyway, as 60015 Ben Nevis, complete with brand new cabs and the new tabs that go onto the new PCB. I'm going to look later to see if we can solder these to the tabs to get the lights on the new body shell working. Now, a lot of people might think that it's a bit of a cop-out, which it is, but to get a body shell for free in the correct livery has saved me an awful lot of time and money repainting the body shell that I had. So I've sold the body shell over to my mate Phil, who's going to put it to good use on one of his 60s, and it's in the livery of his era, so it's not going to go to waste at all. So yeah, that's the end of the blue body shell, so we're going to concentrate on the train load construction one. And just as proof there, it's an exact fit. It's just the wiring's slightly different. So there you go, it clips on there, and already it's starting to look better, and we haven't even tackled what's wrong with it yet. So having a look on the inside of the chassis, there's hairs, there's a piece of loose detailing that's got stuck in the horrible black tack that Hornby have used. And these wheels and axles are just absolutely incredibly dirty. I mean, the fluff around the brake blocks alone, it would just is enough to put some people off. So I reckon that this model in the past has belonged to a young person who's ran this extensively on a carpet. There is no way a model that has ran on a layout has got this dirty. So to release the bogies, you have to unclip this retaining piece here that also holds the worm gearing off the drive shaft. And once you can manipulate it out, the bogie simply falls out. Although it is held in place, and you can see there just how loose everything is, it's held in place with the pickup wires. But we're going to snip these off anyway, as a couple of the soldering joints had come undone, so I'm going to rewire this completely. Now, that bogie frame doesn't look too bad, but the actual bogie itself, like I said, is absolutely filthy, and it was horrible. The amount of dirt that comes off these bogies in this rebuild is unbelievable. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to snip the pickup wires there, just to release the bogie frame from the chassis, and we'll deal with the bogies one at a time. The bogie side frame itself doesn't look too bad, but like I said, the wheels and that, it's just horrible. To release the wheels, you have to release this keeper plate, and I use it by gently inserting a blunt scalpel to create a gap, and then manipulate a flat bladed screwdriver into the gap to release it. Trying to release the clips individually just results in them breaking, and I find this an easier way of removing these clips. And you can see there around all the brake gear and the pickups just how mucky this is. So using my usual method of cotton bud and methylated spirits, I'm going to start by cleaning all these wheel backs, which are covered in a thick layer of oil and grease. And there's also an extensive amount of hair and fibres wrapped around each of the axles. So if I just get my tweezer nose pliers here and try and pull it off, I mean, you can see there just how much comes off. So I've speeded this footage up because it did take a while, and I had to do this on all 6 axles. At some point there was hair and fibre wrapped around each one. And it was a miracle really that this model was still performing quite as well as it did. But I mean, just look at that, and that's just off one axle. So that is proper grim, that is. So to clean the bogey main part up, I first pull off all the fluff. I mean, look at it. I pull all that off with the tweezer nose pliers, and once I've removed the majority of it, I then give it a good brushing over with a dry toothbrush, and then I clean everything with methylated spirits on the end of the toothbrush, and then I give it a final wipe with a cotton bud. I have to work really carefully doing this, as one wrong move and I'm going to bend those pickups out of position, and the brass Hornby uses is rather thin, so trying to bend it back may result in me snapping it, so I have to work carefully. And then, like I said, just tidy it up with some cotton bud and methylated spirits. And even after about half an hour's work, there's still a lot of dirt coming off this model. I also clean up the wheel keeper plate there, just to remove the fibres and grime that's built up on the bottom there. And then I get another brush after it's been left to dry overnight, and just to dust off the remaining fluff and debris. And then it's looking like we can start rebuilding this bogey and then focus on the next one. And any other problems this 60 might throw at us. So yeah, that's looking loads better now. The brass is all clean. You can see there that one of the pickups was already bent, so I've tried to manipulate that back into shape. And the wheels have all been nicely cleaned now and are debris free. The underside of the chassis was coated in a thick layer of sandy type dust. You can see it there, that light coloured stuff. So I actually get the cotton bud and meths initially to try and wipe it all off, but then I realised it'd be easier to probably dust it off dry, so I leave that and then get the paintbrush again and then dust all the dust off. And this method removes 99% of it. The other few bits that were left were just swept away with a cotton bud. But I get right in there, right where the drive shaft is, and remove all that horrible, it was almost like a sandy type dust. I'm not quite sure what it was. Now you can see there it's starting to look right now a bit cleaner. So now all the old lubrication and the old mank has been removed, I'm going to re-lubricate the drivetrain within the bogie, as this is inaccessible once the bogie is rebuilt. So I put a fair bit of this silicone grease in, just to make sure that all the cogs and gears are properly lubricated. Using a cotton bud there, a cocktail stick, sorry. And then I start rebuilding the bogie by putting the wheels back in place. And these wheels will only go in one way. If you put them in the wrong way, the cogs won't line up with the drivetrain, and it won't turn the drive wheel, so you'll lose some traction. The wheel there was just slid in and make sure the pickups are touching the wheel backs. And then the same was repeated for the other 2 axles. And the axles were lubricated with a very small amount of oil. And I also oiled the drivetrain just to make sure there's quite a bit of lubrication in there. As I've done this to my 60 and I've had that over 10 years now, my original 60, and it runs as smooth as the day I bought it. So it's all down to good maintenance and good lubrication, although don't overdo it obviously. So now that bogey's been rebuilt, I've not cleaned the wheels yet. I'll do that when it's been completely rebuilt, and use the model's drive force to clean the wheels. But once that's in, I've replaced the chassis plate there, and then put a little bit more grease on that top gear that connects to the worm gear off the drive shaft. Tiny bit of oil there just to dilute the grease a little bit. And then I look at cleaning this bogey retaining clip, which is also very dirty. And this is where some baby wipes came in handy. They removed a lot of the grime and grease that had accumulated on this. And I also replaced the pickup wires. So I was a bit previous there by putting the bogie frame back on. But this black tack stuff that's on this model, this got everywhere. This was absolutely horrible. So I removed all this as well. And surprisingly, using a baby wipe, that seemed to neutralise the stickiness. So I was quite lucky in using that to clean it off my fingers and etc. So now the pickup wires have been replaced, I'm going to thread them through there and put the bogie frame back in place. I would have used black wire, but I haven't got any, so I've used purple and blue just to differentiate the different sides of the model. But you can't see this when the model's rebuilt. You can't see the colour of the wire anyway, so it's neither here nor there. The wires were threaded up through the die-cast chassis, and there's a small hole which allows the bogie to sit in. And then once that was sitting correctly, again with a baby wipe, I remove yet more of this black tack that Hornby have used to stick the wires into the chassis frame. And then I refit the drive shaft to the end of the motor flywheel. And then this worm cog has got two bearings on it that fit into square recesses on the top of the bogie. And then the drive shaft fits into the other drive shaft with means of a slot. And there's also a groove down the middle, so it will only go in one way and ensures a good fit and good traction once it's all back in place. I just manipulate the end bearings back into their relevant slots. Once they're in there, I'm going to replace this retaining clip, and once that's gently manipulated behind the cap and bulkhead, it clips into place, and that bogey's back in place, having been thoroughly cleaned and re-lubricated. It did take a bit of manipulation to get it back in place, but it gets there in the end. So now I'm going to solder the pickups to the corresponding tabs on the PCB on this 60. And this solder method gives a better reliability and better electrical connection than the push fit wires that were on this originally. Yet more black tack there. Honestly, it got everywhere. And then that's one end thoroughly rebuilt, and I'm going to give it a quick test with the battery just to make sure that everything's picking up, and you can see the drive shaft turning there. So all of those 6 wheels on one end have been completely cleaned and rebuilt. Now to get the bogie out the other end, you have to remove this fan assembly, which on this model unfortunately had been glued into the holes in the die-cast chassis. But you can see all the detail Hornby have included in this casing, as on real life 60s you can see through this part of the loco. So gentle manipulation with this pair of tweezer nose pliers gets that fan assembly out, although 2 of the pegs did snap off, and the bogie was removed in exactly the same way, by removing the clip and clipping the wires off the PCB. Now this is the bogie frame that's broken. You can see in a second it's also missing quite a lot of detail. All the sandpipes and footsteps are all missing off this. And again, this bogie was just as dirty as the other one. I'll pull out all the fluff from the brake blocks there. I mean, this really, it's manky. It makes me wonder why people allow their models to get so dirty. So in this time-lapse footage, I time-lapsed this as you've just seen me rebuilding one of the bogies, and this was done in exactly the same way. It was completely stripped down. Everything was cleaned off. All the fibres and hair were removed with various methods of toothbrush and cotton bud and meths. And the bogie was rebuilt and reassembled, and this time the wires were put in on the opposite side to correspond with the other bogie that we rebuilt. And again, I brushed the chassis there and got all the sandy like dust off the chassis and the underframe. So I'm just doing the pickup wires there and lubricating the drivetrain, and then refitting the axles, refitting the keeper plate, giving it a quick test, a roll test on the mat, and this is ready to go back into the chassis. However, like I said, this bogie frame is damaged. Now I'm going to need quite a lot of spares for this Class 60, so I hunted around and I eventually found a damaged, allegedly running chassis on eBay, which I got for £50. It's got the compressors and all the other detail parts I need, as the compressors are not available as a spare, not even from 3D printers. But when you test this chassis, it was sold as a runner, but when I tested it, there's no life in it at all, so I'm not sure if the PCB's gone or what. But this chassis was in a lot better condition dirt-wise than my one, but I'm just going to use this for spares. Everything I need, buffers, couplings, footsteps, compressors, sandboxes, everything I need is on that chassis. And by buying a new chassis, it also gives me a pool of spares for my 60s. I've now got a spare motor, spare wheels, and a spare bogie frame, as this one that I've taken off it is not broken. It's also complete with the sandboxes and bogie steps that were missing off mine. So again, the wires were threaded up through the die-cast holes in the chassis, and this was a little bit more complicated. It was a little bit more fiddly because of all the detail that Hornby have included on this side of the chassis there, and none of it's easily removable without breaking it, as it is all glued in quite firmly. I did attempt to remove some of it, but it was just going to break, so I left it where it was and persevered with trying to put the model back together in less than ideal circumstances. So now the wires are through, there is a small pin that connects onto the bogie, and once that's all in place, the bogie retaining plug was placed back in, or clipped back on should I say, and the bogies have been rebuilt. And now, again, black tack. And now we can look at the lights on this 60. Now what I'm going to do, I'm going to attempt to light up the new Hornby cabs to the old PCB to see if they work. So I snip the plug off the wire there, and then trace the wires back to the PCB. So the first tab, the wire was traced back to one tab, and that's the first wire I traced off the new cab. I soldered that to that tag on the PCB, if that makes sense. So wire 1 of the original tag was soldered to wire 1 on the new cab inserts. However, after all this work, and this took about an hour, because like I said, look, you could just see trying to get the wires out amidst all that that black tack was just a nightmare. But it turns out that Hornby have actually redone the PCB on the new 60s. And instead of having a common negative, I believe, it's now a common positive. So after all this work and wiring up the cabs to what were correct for older style 60s, I found that the lights didn't work as they should. I manipulated the wires around onto different tabs, and I ended up with them working on one end and not the other. And at one point I ended up with reds leading on one end and nothing on the other. So this left me with a bit of a conundrum. As you can see here, I did quite a lot of work with this, and resoldered all the wires and removed the brass tabs off the cab floors. But I contacted my mate who bought the original body shell off me, and I swapped the cabs over and got the original ones back with the brass tabs, and I will solder these to the PCB to try and get the lights to work. It really was a fruitless exercise trying to get the new lighting units to work on the older PCB. So here the cabs have been replaced with the older ones, and I'm now soldering up the wires how they should have been. I'm soldering them onto the cab there for, like I said, better electrical connection rather than relying on those brass tabs rubbing on each other. And I solder all 4 parts, and then I also add some heat shrink tubing to every other brass tab on the cab floor, just so that when the cabs are placed back down, the tabs aren't pushed into each other and cause a short circuit within the light system. So here you can see in this time-lapse footage, I'm just wiring all the cabs up. Again, using the blue and purple TCS wire, as I didn't have any black. And eventually, after some trial and error, I got it working. And there you can see what I meant by the heat shrink on every other brass tab, just to stop any danger of short circuits between the 4 tabs when I refit the body shell to the chassis. So now that all the light wiring has been done and the pickup wiring has been done, the only wiring I've not touched on this model is the motor wiring from the PCB, but that seems to be in good order, so I'm going to leave that as it is. And I'm going to fix the cabs in place using my satin varnish method. Now, a tiny little bit of satin varnish on each of the tab holes inside the cab fronts and round the edges secures the cabs in place well enough for the body shell to go back on, but they're not as secure as though if I want to take them out in the future, the satin varnish joint is very easy to break. I've just run a small bead along the side of the cabs there. And we're getting to the end now of this Class 60 rebuild. One thing I did notice after I'd rebuilt this 60 was that the PCB has either been wired incorrectly by the previous owner, or the switch underneath is wrong, as the night and day mode on this model for the lights is opposite to my Sound 60 that I've had for a few years. So this one has to run in night mode, so to speak, to make the lights match the original 60 that I have in my fleet. So I've fitted a digital decoder, a standard Bachmann 36553 decoder, and I just put a couple of bits of insulation tape on that metal chassis there, just to stop any danger of short circuits from the light units. And there's some black tack on the body shell there, which has got out of the baby wipes. And then testing with the battery, you can see there, and there's the night and day switch I was talking about, that the lights are now working on the 60. So now these are all the detailing parts we need to replace. We've got some buffers, some sandboxes, bogey footsteps, and some ploughs. The original buffer that came with the model was bent, so I'm just straightening that out now with the aid of 2 pairs of smooth tooth pliers. And then once that was all straightened out, the buffers were again refitted into the chassis housing using some satin varnish, which again holds them secure enough for them not to fall out, but it doesn't act as super glue, and there's no danger of any bloom. Whereas if I'd have used super glue, there could have been a white bloom which would have ruined the cab fronts on this model. So just using a cocktail stick, just put some satin varnish into the buffer housing there, and the buffers go one way up. There's a small square tab on the top. So get them into alignment in the correct orientation, and then just gently push them home and allow the satin varnish to dry, and the buffers have been refitted to the chassis. Next up was the bogey footsteps, which were a very tight friction fit, so I didn't think this warranted any sort of adhesive, not even from the varnish. So they would just push fit into the bogey frames. And then I had to refit the compressors. Now, like I said, these are like gold dust. You cannot get these as spares, and nobody 3D prints them. On the donor chassis, one had been snapped off and super glued on, so it's going to have to be glued onto this chassis, whereas the other just came out with its original pegs, so that one was just pushed back in place as it should have been. And using a very small amount of Loctite super glue, I then glue the other compressor into its place, and we are almost done with the chassis detail that was missing on this 60. I also replaced 2 or 3 sandboxes on either bogey, which had also gone walkabout from its previous owner. I'm just going to hold that compressor there in place just while the glue sets. And now, while the loco is upended in the loco cradle, they're the sandboxes. As I said, you've got to get the correct hand. Obviously, as there's right and left hand ones for this model, and they just push fit onto 2 tabs on the casting of the bogey frame. And then the ploughs were fitted, and I opted for the ploughs with the holes in for the couplings, as I'm going to add wire couplings to this 60 as I have done my original one. And like I said earlier, while the loco's upended in the cradle, I'm going to put some power to the wheels. At this time I put the power through the a piece of rail and used a controller, and then polished all the wheels up using a fiberglass pencil, and then final polishing with a cotton bud and methylated spirits, just to ensure that all the wheels were very clean, and this will prove to be a nice reliable runner, as the Class 60 is one of Hornby's top diesels. In terms of performance and detail, the Class 60 really did set a benchmark after the release of the likes of the Class 60, etc. The Class 50, sorry, should I say. So that's it. This 60's now been rebuilt from its blue, horrible, dirty condition, and it sits there quite proud with its new body shell. So let's remind ourselves of what we started with at the start of this rebuild. This British Steel 60 EWS loco was missing almost all of its detail parts underneath. It was absolutely coated in fluff, gunk and horrible stuff, and being ran on a carpet. It must have been a shag pile carpet, the amount of rubbish that was underneath it. And all the detail on the underframe, like I said, was missing. The buffers were missing, although it did run rather nicely. So after a couple of days work and a nice email from Hornby Railways, this is what she looks like now. Standing in a correct livery for my era of rail freight construction. The horns obviously are okay because they came on the new body shell. The buffers have all been replaced. All the underframe detail has been repaired and replaced, and the chassis and drivetrains and bogies have had a thorough rewire and have been completely rebuilt. Another bonus from having an additional chassis to rob off is I've now got a pool of spares should anything happen to one of my 60s. If you've got an engine you'd like to see featured on a future episode of Trash to Track, or if it's just in need of a general repair, please email me at the email address on screen, dansmodelrailways@gmail.com, and we'll have a look at getting it sent over, repaired, and who knows, it may even feature in a Trash to Track episode all of its own. I'll leave you now with some shots of the 60 running round with a correct rake of Redland hoppers for a construction liveried loco, and I'll catch you in the next video. Please like, share and subscribe, and thank you very much for watching. Bye for now.